The morning the police showed up at my property, I honestly thought somebody must have called them for a real emergency. Maybe a boating accident, maybe a break-in somewhere around the lake. What never crossed my mind was that they were there because of me. I had been in town less than 3 hours. One minute I was standing on the porch of the old cabin my uncle left me, holding a box labeled kitchen stuff, and wondering whether I'd finally found a place where life might slow down a little, and the next, 2 sheriff's cruisers came flying down the gravel road with lights flashing. Then I saw her. Every neighborhood has that one person. The person who acts like they're running a small country instead of living in a subdivision. In my case, her name was Denise Holloway. I didn't know her name yet, but I remember the image perfectly. Bright red visor, white tennis shoes, clipboard tucked under one arm like it was a weapon. She marched straight toward the deputies while pointing at me like she'd just caught America's Most Wanted. "That's him," she yelled. "I've been telling you he's here illegally." The older deputy looked confused. The younger one looked like he was trying not to laugh. Meanwhile, I just stood there holding a box full of coffee mugs, wondering what in the world was happening. The older deputy finally asked, "Sir, do you live here?" "I sure hope so," I said. "I bought the place last week." That was apparently the wrong answer. Denise practically exploded. "No, he didn't." The deputy looked at her. She looked at me. I looked at both of them. And right there, before I'd even unpacked my first box, I realized something important. This woman genuinely believed she was in charge. Not of the neighborhood. Not of the homeowners association. Of everything. I pulled up the deed on my phone and handed it over. "My uncle owned this cabin for almost 40 years, I explained. "When he passed away, the property transferred to me." The deputy checked the documents for about 30 seconds before handing the phone back. "Everything looks legitimate." That should have ended it. Normal people would have accepted the answer. Denise was not normal people. "Well, he never registered with the community board," she snapped. The deputy frowned. "The what?" "The board. The neighborhood council. The lakeside committee." She kept adding names, as if eventually one of them would sound official. The deputy asked the question that changed everything. "Is this property actually part of your association?" For the first time, Denise hesitated. Only for a second. But I noticed. Then she straightened her shoulders and said, "Of course it is." I didn't say anything. The deputy didn't say anything. Because both of us had already seen the uncertainty flash across her face. A few minutes later, the deputies left. Before climbing into his cruiser, the older deputy looked back at me and quietly said, "Good luck." At the time, I thought it was a strange thing to say. A week later, it made perfect sense. Because Denise didn't leave. She set up a folding chair near the edge of my property. Then she sat down and watched me for hours. At first, I assumed she was kidding. Nobody actually does that. But around lunchtime, she pulled out binoculars. Around 3 o'clock, she started taking notes. By dinner, she had taken pictures of my truck, my porch, my mailbox, and somehow my sandwich. The next morning, she returned with paperwork. A lot of paperwork. "You've accumulated multiple violations." I stared at the stack she handed me. Improper waste container placement. Unauthorized dock activity. Visual obstruction of community aesthetics. I read the pages twice before looking up. "Denise," she immediately interrupted. "That's Chairwoman Holloway." I laughed. Big mistake. Her expression hardened. "I don't think you understand how things work around here." What she didn't realize was that I was beginning to understand exactly how things worked around there. And the more I learned about Denise Holloway, the more I started wondering whether the problem wasn't me at all. Maybe the problem was that someone had been playing Queen of the Lake for so long that nobody had ever bothered to tell her she wasn't actually wearing a crown. Over the next few days, Denise became impossible to ignore. Every morning at exactly 7 o'clock, she'd appear at the edge of my property like some kind of HOA alarm clock nobody asked for. Same visor, same clipboard, same expression that somehow managed to combine disappointment, suspicion, and superiority all at once. The first couple days, I tried being polite. My Uncle Ethan had always been the calm one in the family. Growing up, he'd tell me, most difficult people eventually run out of energy if you don't feed the fire. Turns out Uncle Ethan never met Denise Holloway. She seemed to generate her own fuel. On Monday, she fined me because my trash bins were facing the wrong direction. On Tuesday, she claimed my dock extended 18 inches beyond community standards. On Wednesday, she informed me that my mailbox color was creating visual disharmony. Visual disharmony. I wish I were making that up. What color is it supposed to be? I asked. Approved lake gray. It's black. Exactly. As she walked away, I honestly couldn't tell if she was serious anymore. Then Thursday happened. I came home from town carrying groceries and found bright orange tape wrapped around my dock. Not just a little tape. The entire dock looked like a crime scene. A laminated notice flapped in the breeze. Immediate violation. Unauthorized watercraft activity. I stood there reading it. Then I read it again. Then I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the groceries. I didn't own a boat. I had never owned a boat. There wasn't even a canoe anywhere near my property. When Denise appeared 10 minutes later, I pointed toward the sign. What watercraft? She adjusted her sunglasses. Potential watercraft. I blinked. Potential? We must be proactive. That was the moment I stopped viewing her as an annoying neighbor and started viewing her as a problem. Because the thing about people like Denise isn't that they enjoy rules. It's that they enjoy power. The rules are just the excuse. That night, I called my friend Jake. Jake and I had been roommates years ago before he became a surveyor for the county. After listening to 20 minutes of HOA horror stories, he laughed and said something that stuck with me. You know what I want to see? What? The actual property records. The next morning, I started digging. At first, it was just curiosity. Then it became fascination. Then it became something else entirely. Because the deeper I looked, the stranger things became. The county records showed my cabin had existed nearly 40 years before Lakeside Ridge Estates was ever developed. My uncle never joined the HOA, never signed anything, never transferred authority. Legally speaking, the association had absolutely no control over my property. None. Zero. Case closed. Except it wasn't. Because while reviewing old surveys, I noticed something interesting. The HOA's private beach wasn't actually theirs. Neither was part of the boat launch. Or a large section of the walking trail residents had been told belonged exclusively to the community. I requested more documents. Then more. Then even more. 3 days later, my dining table looked like a detective's office from a crime movie. Maps, emails, property boundaries, permit records, and sitting in the middle of everything was one document that made me stop cold. An email chain, years old, between Denise and several former board members. I remember staring at the screen and rereading one sentence 3 times. Consistent enforcement pressure should encourage shoreline owners outside association jurisdiction to voluntarily comply. Voluntarily comply. That was their phrase. Not invite. Not educate. Not cooperate. Pressure. I leaned back in my chair and it just sat there. Suddenly everything made sense. My uncle, the other older cabins, the constant intimidation, the endless citations. The reason Denise had reacted so aggressively the moment I arrived. She knew my property wasn't under her authority. She just assumed I'd never question her. And apparently that strategy had worked for years. The next week things escalated quickly. Denise formed what she proudly called the Community Compliance Committee. 3 women started following her around everywhere. Matching visors, matching clipboards, matching attitudes. Together, they became what locals secretly called the Pink Patrol. I learned that nickname from a neighbor named Linda. Linda lived 2 houses down and had spent years avoiding conflict. One evening, she quietly stopped by while Denise was busy photographing my shed. You know, Linda said softly, people are starting to notice what you're doing. What am I doing? Not backing down. She smiled. You'd be surprised how unusual that is around here. Then she told me stories. Stories about residents paying fines they never owed. Stories about threats. Stories about neighbors who sold their homes because they got tired of fighting. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. This was bigger, much bigger. Meanwhile, Denise seemed convinced she was winning. One afternoon, she marched onto the road carrying a decibel meter. I watched from my porch. She stood near the dock, waited, then pointed dramatically at the screen. 81 decibels. I looked around. What made 81 decibels? You. I was walking, aggressively. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I laughed. The members of her committee frowned. Denise looked offended, and suddenly I wasn't laughing anymore. Because behind all the ridiculousness was something ugly, something deliberate. She wasn't trying to enforce standards. She was trying to exhaust people, wear them down, make resistance feel harder than surrender. And that's exactly when I decided to stop defending myself. Instead, I was going to start asking questions. A week later, the first state inspector arrived. Then another. Then another. Environmental officials. Land surveyors. County investigators. Every single one had questions about permits, shoreline access, and protected wetlands. The moment Denise realized they weren't there because of me, I saw genuine fear cross her face for the first time. And believe me, after weeks of watching her act invincible, that expression was unforgettable. But the biggest explosion was still coming. Because within days, Lakeside Ridge Estates announced an emergency HOA meeting. The entire neighborhood would be there. Denise planned to put me on trial in front of everyone. What she didn't know was that I was walking into that meeting carrying something far more dangerous than complaints. I was carrying proof. And before the night was over, the Queen of the Lake was about to discover what happens when the people you've spent years intimidating finally get a chance to see the truth. The clubhouse was already packed when I walked in. You could feel the tension before anyone said a word. Clusters of neighbors stood around whispering. Some looked nervous. Some looked angry. Most looked confused. At the front of the room stood Denise Holloway. For weeks, she'd acted like a queen defending her kingdom. That night, she looked more like a politician trying to survive a scandal. The moment she saw me enter, her eyes narrowed. "There he is," she announced. The room turned toward me. A few people nodded politely. Others simply watched. Denise stepped behind the podium and tapped the microphone. "As most of you know," she began, "our community has recently become the target of a coordinated harassment campaign." I almost laughed. Harassment campaign. That was rich. She spent the next 10 minutes blaming me for everything. The inspectors, the investigations, the state inquiries, the legal notices. According to Denise, I was some disgruntled outsider trying to destroy the community. For a moment, a few residents seemed unsure what to believe. Then somebody raised a hand. It was an older gentleman sitting near the front. "Denise," he asked quietly, "is it true we're facing environmental fines?" Her smile tightened. "Certain issues are under review." Another hand went up. "Is the beach being closed?" "Temporarily." A third person stood. "What about the boat launch?" Now Denise looked irritated. "We're discussing that internally." The room grew louder. People started talking over each other. Questions came from every direction. And for the first time, I realized something important. Most of these people had no idea what had been happening. They trusted her. She'd been feeding them half the story for years. Finally, the HOA treasurer, a man named Robert, raised his hand. "Let's hear everything." The room quieted. Then he looked at me. "Mr. Carter, would you like to speak?" Denise practically lunged toward the microphone. "He's not even a member." Robert didn't look away from me. "I still think we should hear him." The silence that followed felt enormous. I walked to the front carrying a simple folder. Nothing dramatic. No speeches prepared. Just facts. I placed copies on the nearest table. Then I started talking. I explained how my property had never belonged to the HOA. I showed original county surveys. I showed deed records. I showed legal boundaries. One by one, people began flipping through the pages. The room grew quieter with every document. Then I handed out the emails. Those changed everything. You could actually hear pages turning. Then came the murmurs. Then the whispers. Then complete chaos. One resident stood up. Wait, this says the association knew these properties weren't under HOA authority. Another voice. This email is from Denise. Another. What's Operation Shoreline Compliance? I watched Denise's face lose color. Fussed. She grabbed one of the documents. That's taken out of context. Nobody responded. A woman near the back raised her hand. I got fined $700 because my kayak wasn't an approved color. Someone else laughed. Then another resident spoke up. I got cited for having a garden statue. A third person stood. They fined me for feeding birds. A fourth. They threatened legal action because my grandson's treehouse was visible from the road. And suddenly it all came pouring out. Years of frustration. Years of intimidation. Years of quietly accepting things nobody should have accepted. Story after story filled the room. Not because people were angry anymore. Because they were finally no longer afraid. The meeting completely unraveled. Board members argued with each other. Residents demanded explanations. Robert looked like a man discovering he'd accidentally boarded the wrong airplane halfway through a flight. Meanwhile, Denise kept insisting everyone was misunderstanding. But the evidence was sitting right there. Nobody needed my opinion. The documents spoke for themselves. Over the next few months, everything moved surprisingly fast. State agencies completed their investigations. The county issued findings. Attorneys became involved. What started as one ridiculous dispute over HOA authority turned into a full-scale legal disaster. The association was ordered to remove structures built on protected land. Access restrictions were overturned. Several violations resulted in major penalties. And eventually the case landed in court. I attended every hearing. Not because I enjoyed it. Honestly, by then I was exhausted. I just wanted closure. The final ruling came on a rainy Thursday morning. I still remember sitting in that courtroom. The judge spent nearly an hour reviewing findings. Every page seemed worse than the last. Then came the part nobody expected. The judge addressed Denise directly. He cited intentional misrepresentation, abuse of authority, harassment of property owners, failure of fiduciary responsibility. The courtroom became completely silent. Then he issued the decision. Denise Holloway was barred from serving in any HOA leadership position for 10 years. 10 years. You could hear people inhale. The woman who had controlled that neighborhood for years had just lost everything she'd built her identity around. For a moment, she didn't move. She just sat there staring forward. Then reality finally hit. She stood up, started shouting, arguing, accusing everyone around her. The judge, the county, the residents, me, anybody except herself. Security eventually stepped in, and as she was escorted out, something happened I'll never forget. Nobody followed her. Not one person. The people who used to support her. The people who used to fear her. The people who used to stay silent. They simply watched, quietly, and that was probably the hardest consequence of all, because power can disappear overnight. But respect leaves long before that. A few weeks later, I was sitting on my dock watching the sunset when Linda stopped by. The lake looked different somehow. Not because anything had changed physically, but because the tension was gone. The fear was gone. The feeling that one person controlled everyone else was finally gone. Linda sat beside me for a minute and smiled. You know, she said, people keep calling you the guy who saved the neighborhood. I laughed. No, I didn't. She looked surprised. I pointed toward the water. All I did was ask questions. And honestly, that's still how I see it. Because the biggest lesson from everything that happened wasn't about HOAs or lawsuits or difficult neighbors. It was how easy it is for people to accept something simply because it's been happening for a long time. Sometimes nobody challenges a bad system because they assume somebody else already checked it. Sometimes authority survives because nobody asks whether it actually exists. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to say, hold on a second, show me where that's written. Now here's the question I'd love to hear from you. Do you think Denise knew exactly what she was doing the entire time? Or do you think power slowly changed her until she genuinely believed she owned that community? Let me know down in the comments. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who abused a little bit of authority, share your story below. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because trust me, some of the wildest neighborhood stories are still waiting to be told.